The bell clanged before the sun had even touched the horizon. Its metallic scream cut through the darkness of the slave quarters, dragging men, women, children from what little rest their broken bodies had managed to steal in the night. Samuel's eyes opened slowly, as though the lids themselves were made of iron. He lay on the dirt floor. The smell of sweat and damp would heavy around him, listening to the coughing of the others and the shuffle of bare feet preparing for another day in the fields. The chain around his ankle bit at his skin as he sat up. He rubbed at it without thinking, fingers tracing the raw wound where the iron never stopped chafing. His stomach ached from hunger, a gnawing that had no end, no beginning, just an endless hollow that felt as much a part of him as his own bones. Up, up, you worthless dogs. The voice of Harlan, the overseer, thundered from outside. He was always waiting before dawn, whip in hand, his face red and eager like a butcher before slaughter. Samuel rose slowly, joints stiff, muscles burning from the day before. He was 25, but carried the weight of a man twice his age. His back was a map of scars, some fresh, some faded, each one a reminder of lessons learned at the end of Harlan's whip. He moved toward the door, where the other slaves were already lining up. Eyes downcast, faces pale with dread. The air outside was cold. Out. The dew clinging to their bare feet as they marched toward the fields. The sky was only beginning to lighten, streaks of gray stretching across the horizon. Samuel lifted his eyes for only a second, watching the stars vanish into the coming day. He used to love the stars as a child, lying beside his mother and listening to her hum old songs. But that was before she had been sold away. That memory now cut deeper than any whip. The cotton field stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of sharp bowls waiting to tear skin and shred fingers. The work began without a word. Samuel bent low, his hands already raw from weeks of harvest, and began pulling, stuffing, moving with mechanical precision. The overseer's horse paced nearby, Harlan watching for any sign of weakness. The sun rose higher, burning away the cold, pressing down on them with its heavy weight. Sweat stung Samuel's eyes, his back hunched, his breath short. Around him, the moans and labored breathing of others filled the air, yet no one dared slow. To falter was to invite the lashed hours past. The world became nothing but cotton, sweat, and pain. Samuel's thoughts drifted to the oak tree, where he used to play with his little sister, to the taste of cornbread his mother used to bake, to the warmth of a freedom he barely remembered, those memories fragile and fleeting, were all that tethered him to something human. By midday, his shirt was soaked through, his fingers bleeding. When he glanced to his left, he saw a young boy, no more than 12, stumble. The boy tried to right himself, but his knees buckled. Before Samuel could even take a step toward him, Harlan was there. The crack of the whip split the air like thunder. The boy cried out, curling into the dirt, but the whip came down again and again until his cries turned into silence. Harlan spat on the ground beside him and barked for the others to keep working. The boy was dragged away, limp, like a broken tool. Samuel kept his eyes low, forcing himself to continue picking. His chest ached, his stomach roiled, but he dared not falter. Every lash he had taken before rang in his bones, a reminder of the price of hesitation. The field was soaked with more than sweat. It was soaked with fear. When the sun finally began to sink, they were herded back toward the quarters. Samuel's hands throbbed, his back screamed, but no rest awaited. Only the promise of another dawn, another chain. Another day stolen from him, that night. As he lay on the dirt floor, he whispered into the darkness, "Mama, I still hear you singing." The words barely reached his own ears, but they carried him into sleep, a fragile ember in the ashes of his soul. The morning heat was already heavy by the time the slaves reached the fields again. The sun had not yet climbed high, but its rays pressed down as though the sky itself were angry. Samuel bent low, his body aching from the day before, his fingers raw and swollen from cuts that had never healed. He tried to move quickly, but every movement pulled at his torn skin, and every breath felt like it dragged fire into his chest. Harlan, The overseer sat tall on his horse, whip coiled in his hand like a serpent waiting to strike. His eyes scanned the field with a hunter's patience. He had no need to hurry. Weakness always showed itself in time. Samuel knew the danger of drawing attention. He kept his head down, back bent, cotton filling his sack as steadily as his broken body could manage. Yet his stomach betrayed him. The emptiness gnawed so fiercely that his legs trembled, and his hands slowed against his will. It was a stumble, just one. His foot caught on a root, and he fell hard into the dirt. His sack spilled open, cotton scattering like snow across the ground. For a heartbeat, silence seemed to hang in the air. Then the horse's hooves thundered closer. Harlan was upon him, you clumsy piece of filth. The overseer roared, leaping down from his horse. His whip uncoiled with a hiss. Samuel scrambled to his knees, trying to gather the cotton, but a sharp crack split the air. Pain ripped across his back, white-hot, stealing his breath. He gasped, but did not cry out. He had learned long ago that to scream was to invite more lashes. He bit down hard on his tongue, tasting blood. Another crack. The leather tore through his shirt, cutting skin already scarred. The pain burned deep, radiating through his ribs. "Stand up," Harlan bellowed. Samuel forced himself to his feet, every muscle trembling. His sack lay forgotten in the dirt. The overseer struck again. Samuel's knees buckled, but he did not fall. He clenched his fists at his sides, head bowed, lips pressed shut. Around him, the other slaves froze in their rows, eyes fixed on their work, too afraid to look up. But Samuel could feel their silence, their helplessness, wrapping around him like a shroud. Harlan's whip cracked across him 3 more times, each lash carving deeper into his back. His vision blurred, but still he refused to cry out. He would not give Harlan that satisfaction. Finally, the overseer stepped back, chest heaving with the thrill of his cruelty. "Pick it up," he snarled. "And if you spill it again, I'll flay you alive." Samuel bent slowly, his whole body screaming, and gathered the scattered cotton with trembling hands. The overseer mounted his horse again, the whip dangling loosely, his eyes already searching for his next victim. When the sun finally sank low, painting the sky with crimson light, the slaves were marched back to their quarters. Samuel's back burned with every step, his shirt sticking to his wounds. He could barely straighten himself, yet he forced his legs to keep moving. Inside the dim quarters, he sank to the dirt floor, his breath ragged. He pressed his palm to the torn flesh of his back, but the pain was too sharp to bear. For a moment, he thought he might collapse entirely. It was then that Ruth came to him. The older woman carried no food, no water. She had nothing to give but her hands and her words. She knelt beside him, her eyes soft, though rimmed with sorrow. "Hold still, child," she whispered, tearing a strip from her own ragged skirt. She pressed the cloth gently against his wounds. The touch was tender, though it could not stop the bleeding. Samuel's eyes burned, but not from pain. For a fleeting moment, the overseer's cruelty was answered by this woman's quiet mercy. "They want to break you," Ruth murmured, "but you must not let them. Not in here." She tapped lightly at his chest, where his heart still beat steady despite it all. Samuel closed his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but his body felt broken, his spirit bent low. Yet in the silence of the night her words lingered. The whip could tear flesh, but it had not stolen his breath. Not yet. And as the darkness swallowed the quarters, Samuel lay awake. The sting of lashes etched into his skin, a reminder of Harlan's power, but also of his own refusal to be silenced. The next morning broke with a heavy fog, the kind that clung to the skin and chilled the bones. Samuel's back burned where the whip had carved fresh lines, every movement tearing open wounds that had barely begun to clot. Still he rose when the bell rang. There was no choice. In slavery, even pain was not excuse enough to stop. Before they were sent to the fields, the slaves were handed their rations. Samuel received a hunk of bread so hard it scraped his teeth when he bit into it. The crust was gray with mold, the inside dense and sour. Beside it, a tin cup of murky water, more grit than drink. This was the food meant to sustain them for an entire day of brutal labor. He chewed slowly. forcing the bread down despite the bile rising in his throat. As he swallowed, a memory struck him so vividly it almost buckled his knees. His mother's kitchen. The warmth of a small fire. The sweet smell of cornbread, golden and soft, pulled from a cast-iron pan. He could still see her hands, dark and strong, cutting slices for him and his little sister. That bread had been full of love. This bread, moldy, tasteless, dead, was full of chains. He held the memory like a fragile ember, even as his stomach turned from the food in his hand. Around him, the others ate in silence, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical. Hunger had stripped away everything but survival. Ruth sat beside him, chewing her own ration with effort. She noticed Samuel's grimace, the way he struggled to swallow. Without a word, she broke her piece in half and pushed it toward him. "Take it," she said softly. Samuel shook his head. "You need it as much as I do." Her eyes, tired but steady, met his. "Child, sometimes the only way we survive is by keeping each other standing. Don't argue." He hesitated, then accepted the bread. It was a small act, almost nothing in the face of their suffering. Yet to Samuel, it was everything. In a world that stripped them of dignity, Ruth's kindness reminded him that humanity had not been completely stolen. Later that day, Master Carter rode through the fields. Unlike Harlan, he did not shout or whip. He did not need to. His cruelty was quieter, colder. He inspected the slaves as one would inspect livestock, his gaze sliding over their bent backs and blistered hands without the faintest flicker of emotion. To him, they were not people. They were tools, numbers, investments. Samuel kept his eyes on the cotton, but he felt Carter's presence like a shadow pressing on his soul. The master's silence was worse than Harlan's violence. At least the overseer's whip acknowledged their existence. Carter's indifference erased them completely. That evening, after the day's labor, Samuel lay on the floor of the quarters, his body trembling with exhaustion. His belly groaned, empty even after the bread. But his mind was far away, back in that memory of his mother's kitchen, back in a life that had been stolen. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Cornbread. Mama's cornbread." Ruth, lying nearby, heard him. She did not speak, but her eyes closed, as if she too was carried back by the memory of food made with love, not cruelty. The room was filled with the soft sounds of weary breathing, of bodies pressed close for warmth. Outside, the whip, the overseer, and the master still ruled. But inside, in the quiet corners of memory and kindness, the slaves clung to scraps of humanity. For Samuel, the taste of moldy bread lingered bitter on his tongue, but somewhere deep in his chest, so did the sweetness of his mother's cornbread. One reminded him of the chains. The other reminded him of who he truly was before the chains. And though the whip would strike again, though hunger would gnaw forever, that memory could not be taken, not be taken. The night brought no rest. Samuel tossed on the dirt floor of the quarters, his wounds searing, his stomach empty. When sleep finally claimed him, it carried him back to another world, one that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He was under the great oak tree again, its branches wide and protective, shading the earth where he and his little sister Anna once played. She had a laugh like a song, clear and bright, and her tiny hands clutched his as they ran circles in the grass. Their mother sat nearby, humming as she sewed, her voice rising with the wind. In the dream, everything was whole. In the dream, freedom was not a question, but a birthright. Then, as dreams do, it twisted. The oak became bare, stripped of leaves. His sister's hand slipped from his, pulled away by faceless men. His mother screamed his name, reaching for him, but chains coiled around her arms, dragging her into darkness. Samuel woke gasping, his cheeks wet with tears, his chest tight as though the whip had found him even in sleep. The bell clanged. Morning again. In the fields, the sun beat down harder than ever, turning sweat into fire on their backs. The cotton seemed endless, white bowls stretching farther than the eye could see, as though mocking the slaves with its purity while their hands bled red into its fibers. Near Samuel, a boy no older than 14 worked with desperate haste. His ribs showed through his skin, his hands trembling with fatigue. Samuel watched him sway, his knees wobbling, until at last the boy crumpled to the ground. "Get up." Harlan's voice tore through the air, sharp as the whip in his hand. The boy didn't move. He tried. Samuel could see him clawing at the dirt, fighting to rise, but his body had nothing left to give. The overseer's whip cracked once, then again, then again. The sound echoed across the field, cutting into every slave's spine. The boy's cries filled the air, high and broken, until his voice gave way to silence. Harlan spat into the dirt and ordered 2 men to drag the limp body away. Samuel bent lower, his fingers moving blindly through the cotton. He wanted to run to the boy, to shield him as Ruth had shielded Samuel before. But his legs were rooted in fear. His silence burned worse than the whip. He hated himself for it, yet he knew one act of defiance would only add his own broken body to the pile. That night, while the others ate their rations in silence, Samuel slipped outside the quarters. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the sky. He lifted his face toward them, his chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths. "Anna," he whispered, naming the sister he had not seen in nearly 15 years. "Are you alive? Do you remember me, Mama? If you can hear me sing again?" Just once. The wind stirred, carrying the sound of insects and rustling grass, but no song answered. Samuel's throat tightened. He sank to his knees, pressing his forehead to the earth. His prayers had no church, no altar. Only the stars bore witness. Behind him, a quiet voice broke the silence. "You speak to the night like it can hear." Samuel turned to see Ruth standing in the doorway of the quarters. Her eyes were weary, but not unkind. "Sometimes," she said, stepping closer, "the stars are the only ones who listen." Samuel's voice cracked. "I can't stop wondering where they are. My mama, my sister, I don't even know if they're alive." Ruth laid a hand on his shoulder, her palm rough from years of labor, yet steady. "That's the worst cruelty of all. They don't just chain our bodies. They take our families, our names, our stories. But you keep them alive when you speak their names. That's how we fight." Her words sank deep, though they brought no comfort. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the stars. Inside the quarters, the slaves lay silent. Outside, Samuel whispered the names again, Anna, Mama, each syllable a fragile act of resistance. He had no weapons, no freedom, no strength left to fight. But he had memory, and for now, memory was all he had to keep himself human, keep himself human. The announcement came at dawn. Master Carter stood outside the slave quarters, his polished boots gleaming in the dirt, his posture tall and self-satisfied. Behind him, Harlan grinned like a wolf. "Some of you will be sold today," Carter said, his voice calm, almost bored. "New buyers are coming. Fresh hands are needed elsewhere. You'll fetch a good price, I expect. The rest of you," his cold eyes swept across their bent figures back to the fields. "Don't think about it too much. Property doesn't get a choice." A hush fell over the quarters. Property. That word stung sharper than the whip. Mothers clutched children tighter. Couples exchanged desperate looks. No one dared speak, but the air was filled with silent panic. The terror of not knowing whose names were written on the master's list. By mid-morning, wagons rattled into the yard. Buyers climbed down, fat men in fine coats, their voices full of laughter and coins jingling in their pockets. They smelled of tobacco and rum, and when they looked at the slaves, their eyes glittered with calculation, not humanity. Samuel stood in the line, his stomach a knot. He wasn't on Carter's list. He could feel it in the master's indifference, but he still trembled. Because even if he stayed, others would not. A young mother named Leah was pulled forward first. She clung to her little boy, no more than 6 years old, pressing his face into her chest. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling, "don't take him from me." The buyers laughed. One reached out, prying the child from her arms as though tearing meat from bone. Leah screamed, dropping to her knees, clawing at the ground as Harlan struck her with the butt of his whip. The boy cried out, reaching for his mother. But his small arms were no match for the men who dragged him away. Samuel's heart pounded. The The scene tore at him worse than any lash. He remembered Anna's hands slipping from his in his dream, his mother's cry. It was happening again, not to him this time, but to someone else. Yet the pain was the same, one by one. Bodies were examined like cattle. Buyers prodded muscles, forced mouths open to check teeth, pinched arms to test for strength. Prices were haggled over while the slave stood silent. Stripped of dignity, stripped of choice, Samuel kept his head down. But his ears caught every sound, the pleading, the weeping, the curses of the buyers when Carter drove a harder bargain. Each voice was a wound. Each sale was a death of something unseen. When the wagons finally rolled away, they carried with them children, torn from parents, husbands torn from wives, sisters torn from brothers. The yard was left in silence, broken only by the faint sobbing of those who remained. That night in the quarters, the grief was suffocating. No one spoke loudly. Some didn't speak at all. The air was thick with sorrow, too heavy for words. Leah lay curled on the dirt floor, her body rocking with soundless cries. Ruth held her, whispering fragments of old hymns. Though her own eyes were wet, Samuel sat in the shadows, fists clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms. He wanted to rage, to scream, to strike out against the world that allowed such cruelty. But his voice stayed trapped in his throat. Rage without power was just another chain. He stared into the darkness, and in that silence, something inside him hardened. The grief was still there, deep, raw, unending. But beneath it, another feeling began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but something sharper, more dangerous. A quiet, smoldering anger. He thought of Ruth's words, of keeping memory alive as a weapon. He thought of his mother's cornbread, of Anna's laughter, of Leah's scream. The masters could tear families apart. They could sell flesh and spill blood. But they could not erase what lived inside the heart. That night, Samuel lay awake long after the others had drifted into restless slumber. His back burned, his stomach gnawed, but his mind was alive with one truth. Survival meant carrying the weight of the lost. Every name, every face, every stolen voice, he would remember. He must remember. He must remember. The night after the auction was heavier than most. The quarters felt emptier, hollowed by absence. The air carried the silence of missing voices, children's laughter, mothers' lullabies, all gone, sold like tools passed from one master's hand to another. Samuel sat near the wall, staring into the dark. His thoughts churned with anger that had no outlet. He kept seeing Leah's boy, dragged screaming into the wagon. He kept hearing Leah's cries, still echoing in the corners of the quarters. A whisper broke through the silence. Samuel. He turned and saw Elijah crouched nearby. The boy was young, barely 20, his face thin, but his eyes alight with something dangerous, a fire Samuel had not seen in years. "We can't keep living like this," Elijah murmured, glancing toward the doorway where the guards lingered outside. "I've heard talk. There are places north." Freedom. Samuel's chest tightened. Freedom. The word itself was both a bomb and a curse. He had heard the stories too, whispers of runaways, of safe houses, of rivers that led to lands where no master's whip reached. But he had also heard the other stories. Bodies found hanging from trees, dogs tearing men apart, blood soaking the dirt of failed escapes. "Elijah," Samuel said, his voice low. "You don't know what you're saying? They'll kill you." "They're already killing us," Elijah hissed back. "One lash, one day, one sale at a time. Death out there is no worse than dying slow here." Samuel had no reply. His heart raced at the thought. He could almost see it himself, walking under a sky with no chains, no overseer's shadow, his mother's voice calling, his sister's hand in his own. For a moment, the dream rose up so clear he could taste it. But before he could speak again, a crash shattered the night. The overseer's voice thundered from the doorway. "Up, all of you, up." Harlan stormed inside with 2 guards, dragging a man by the collar. Blood streaked the man's face, his hands bound. Samuel recognized him, Isaac, an older slave who had once stolen a turnip from the fields to quiet his child's hunger, caught this thief trying again. Harlan spat. "Let this be a lesson. They dragged Isaac outside into the yard. The slaves were forced to follow, circling in silence. Under the cold moonlight, Isaac was tied to a post, a shirt torn from his back. The whip cracked once, twice, then again, tearing through flesh. Isaac's cries filled the air, raw and desperate. Samuel flinched with each strike, his own scars burning in sympathy. Around him, the others watched with empty eyes. They had seen this too many times before. Steal from the master, and this is what you earn. Harlan shouted between lashes. Talk of escape, and you'll earn worse. Samuel's eyes shot to Elijah, whose face had gone pale. The overseer's words were no accident. Somehow whispers had reached him. Fear settled over the crowd like a heavy fog, choking the fire Elijah had tried to spark. When Isaac collapsed, his back a ruin of blood and torn skin, Harlan untied him and let him crumple into the dirt. No one moved to help until the overseer and guards were gone. Then Ruth crept forward, kneeling beside the broken man, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth to his wounds. Samuel stood frozen, shame and rage colliding inside him. The image of freedom had vanished, replaced by Isaac's blood glistening under the moon. Later, back in the quarters, Elijah's voice trembled as he whispered, "They'll kill us all before they let us be free." Samuel met his eyes. He wanted to say the fire was worth it, that the dream was worth the risk, but the taste of fear still clung to his tongue. He lay awake long after the others had drifted into uneasy sleep. Freedom had never felt so close, and yet so impossibly far. The overseer's lash had not only torn Isaac's flesh, it had struck at Samuel's very soul, reminding him of the cost of even daring to dream. Still, deep within, something stirred, a whisper that even fear could not silence. What if? What if? The sun rose hot and merciless over the cotton fields. Dew clung to the leaves, but it offered no relief. By mid-morning, sweat already drenched Samuel's shirt, stinging the lashes carved across his back. Each step through the rows was a battle, each movement of his hands through the thorned branches another wound. The overseer, Harlan, rode the edge of the fields on horseback, his whip coiled loosely in his hand like a serpent waiting to strike. Faster. Harlan barked, his voice cracking like thunder. "You think this field will pick itself?" Samuel bent low, his fingers trembling as they pulled the white bolls free. The cotton pricked his skin, leaving tiny cuts, and every handful reminded him of the weight of chains on his life. Around him, other slaves worked in silence, heads bowed, too afraid to meet the overseer's eyes. The air buzzed with cicadas, the sound rising and falling like a mournful dirge. By noon, Samuel's sack was only half full. Harlan noticed. "You there?" Harlan shouted, dismounting his horse. He stalked toward Samuel, whip in hand. "Lazy again, are you?" Samuel's chest tightened. He had heard those words before, every slave had. They were always followed by pain. Before Harlan reached him, Ruth stepped forward from a nearby row. Her voice trembled, but it carried strength. "It's not his fault. He's still healing from the last lashing. Give him time." The field went still. Every slave froze, horrified. Speaking back, even a whisper, was a death sentence. Harlan's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Oh, is that so? The woman speaks for him." He turned to Samuel. "You let her fight your battles now?" Samuel opened his mouth to protest, but Ruth shook her head sharply, silencing him. Her eyes burned with a fierce, unspoken command. "Stay silent." Harlan grabbed Ruth by the arm and dragged her into the open. "You want to share his burden? Then share it." The whip cracked through the air. Ruth didn't cry out at first, only clenched her jaw, her eyes fixed on Samuel. Each strike cut deep, blood staining the back of her dress, soaking the fabric until it clung to her skin. By the 5th lash, her body shook. By the 10th, she fell to her knees. Samuel's vision blurred with rage and grief. Every fiber of his being screamed to rush forward, to throw himself between Ruth and the overseer. But he knew what would come: the whip, the rifle, the dogs. His body tensed with the weight of impossible choice. Ruth lifted her head, her lips barely moving. "Live," she mouthed. "Live." Harlan struck again, and Ruth's body crumpled into the dirt. She didn't move. The overseer spat on the ground and turned to the others. Back to work, or she won't be the only one. No one dared disobey. The field filled again with the rustle of hands in the cotton, but the air was heavier than ever. Samuel staggered back to his row, his chest heaving, his heart shattered. His hands bled as he tore at the cotton, stuffing it into the sack without feeling the pain. His mind was fixed only on Ruth lying still in the dirt. As the sun began to set, the work ended. Ruth was carried back to the quarters by two women, her body limp, her breath faint. Samuel sat beside her all night, holding her hand, whispering her name. Her eyes opened only once, clouded with pain, but she smiled faintly. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered. "Don't let them break you." By dawn, her hand grew cold in his. Samuel wept silently, tears soaking into the earth beneath them. The quarters echoed with quiet grief, every slave mourning in their own silence. Ruth's sacrifice had been more than a defense of him. It was a defiance, spark lit in the heart of despair. But for Samuel, the spark burned like fire in his chest. The whip had taken his mother, his sister, his dignity. Now it had taken Ruth. Something inside him broke, and in that breaking, something new was born. Something new was born. The night after Ruth's death was long and endless. Samuel did not sleep. He sat by her still body, listening to the shallow breaths of the others around him, their silence filled with grief and fear. The quarters had never felt so suffocating. Every scar on his body throbbed like a reminder of everything stolen from him, his family, his freedom, his dignity, and now Ruth. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the walls, Samuel rose. His legs trembled, but not from weakness. Something inside him had shifted. His sorrow had burned into a cold, unshakable resolve. He tied a strip of torn cloth around his wrist, Ruth's blood still staining it, and stepped outside. The horn blew, summoning the slaves to the fields. They shuffled into the yard, heads low, shoulders bent under the invisible weight of chains. The overseer, Harlan, stood waiting, whip in hand, his eyes scanning the group with cruel satisfaction. "Move," he barked. Samuel didn't move. For the first time in years, he lifted his head and met Harlan's eyes. The overseer paused, frowning. The whip twitched in his hand. "I said move." The sound echoed across the yard, but Samuel stood rooted. His voice, hoarse from years of silence, rose above the hush of the morning. No more. The other slaves froze. It was unthinkable, unheard of, a refusal. Harlan's face twisted with fury. "You dare?" He strode forward, whip uncoiling. "I'll skin you alive." The lash snapped through the air, striking Samuel across the chest. Pain tore through him, but he did not fall. He did not bow. He stood taller, his blood dripping into the dirt. "No more," he repeated, louder this time. Something rippled through the crowd. Slaves who had long forgotten the shape of hope lifted their heads. Eyes met eyes. Silent chains loosened, if only in spirit. Harlan raised the whip again. But this time Samuel stepped forward, closing the space between them. With a strength born not of muscle but of fury and grief, Samuel grabbed the whip mid-swing. The barbs tore into his palm, blood spilling, but he did not let go. He yanked hard, and for a single miraculous moment, the overseer staggered. Gasps filled the yard. The unthinkable had happened. A slave had resisted. The other guards rushed in, rifles raised. The butt of a gun slammed into Samuel's back, driving him to his knees. He coughed blood into the dirt, his body crumbling under the blows. But even as fists and boots rained down, he forced himself up again. His voice broke through the chaos, raw and thunderous. "We are not beasts. We are men." The words hung in the air like a strike of lightning. For the overseer, they were treason. For the slaves, they were truth. Another rifle, but struck Samuel's head. His vision blurred, the world spinning. He collapsed, his body broken beyond, rising again. But as he lay in the dirt, his blood soaking into the soil of the plantation, he felt no shame. Around him, The slaves were no longer silent. Whispers spread, soft but steady. "We are men. We are men." Harlan shouted for silence, lashing his whip wildly, but something had changed. The overseer could beat bodies. He could not erase the words Samuel had spoken. Samuel's breath grew shallow, the sky above him painted with the pale fire of dawn. His last thought was of Ruth, of his mother, of the family torn from him. He pictured them free, their faces lifted, toward a sun that knew no chains. As the light of the new day touched his face, Samuel let go, and though his body was gone, his defiance lingered in the air, a seed buried in blood, waiting to grow, waiting to grow.